Hi, I'm Charles Phoenix, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guile. Every February, the modernist architectural world comes to Palm Springs, California. It's an 11-day architecture and design festival, yet they still call it Modernism Week. Again this year, U.S. Modernist Radio is there, interviewing nearly all of Modernism Week's keynote speakers plus special guests. It all happened at the U.S. Modernist Compound, a.k.a. poolside at the hip Hotel Skylark. Palm Springs has seen its share of glamour, from the Hollywood celebrities who made the place their playground last century to the musicians and the entertainers who keep the party going. Today, we'll hear from Will Friedwald on the jazz trio The Pole Winners, Courtney Newman on the classic entertainers who flocked to Palm Springs, and Susan Claassen, who has brought legendary Hollywood costume designer Edith Head back to life. She was so famous that the character Edna Mode from the Incredibles movie was based on her. Edith Head really dressed everybody. In fact, my conversation with Susan Claassen about Edith Head was one of the highlights for my trip to Modernism Week this year. Because the great thing about modernist design and architecture is the way it attracts interesting people of all kinds. The conversations we have with famous designers, but also with people you may never have heard of, are what make the Mod Week experience so rich. We had a lot of fascinating people just within the U.S. Modernist Compound at the Hotel Skylark. Folks who come from all over just to be a part of the modernism vibe. I must admit that I was kind of surprised on my first morning after we arrived to run into one of the famous architects that we've interviewed previously on U.S. Modernist Radio. We were just waiting for frittatas in the breakfast line at the Skylark. He was just another one of the really interesting, creative people who make up our group every year. It's an amazing week. And now the guy who makes it all happen year after year, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
I gotta tell you, if this sounds fun, it really is. If you're into this kind of architecture, Modernism Week is really the Super Bowl of all the architecture that you love, because there's so many buildings and houses there that have been perfectly preserved and restored over the decades that you literally can spend a week going from tour to tour to tour, and that's what we do. If you'd like to go with me and Tom to Modernism Week in February 2024 and stay with us at the Hotel Skylark, a.k.a. the U.S. Modernist Compound, email me at george@usmodernist.org. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Malibu, Palm Springs, Toronto, and Los Angeles.
Author and jazz critic Will Friedwald earned his BFA in journalism from NYU.
Go Violets!
He has written for decades about jazz for publications such as the New York Sun, the Wall Street Journal, Vanity Fair, and the New York Times. He's the author of 10 jazz books, including Sinatra, The Song Is You, and he has written liner notes for nearly 600 compact discs, for which he has received 11 Grammy nominations.
If you don't know what a compact disc is, young ones, it's a very round thing. You used to put it in this player, but we digress.
Right. It's before vinyl came back. He's the host of the radio show Sing Sing Sing, and at this year's Modernism Week, he presented on the legendary jazz trio The Pole Winners. Here's George's conversation with Will, poolside at the Hotel Skylark.
I noticed about 7 years ago when we were out here in Palm Springs, and back home in North Carolina too, is that every time I went on a modernist house tour, almost 90% of the time, there was jazz playing in the background inside the houses. Do you have a correlation for that too?
Well, I think it's all part of the same continuum in that after World War II, there's this kind of idea of newness in everything, in movies, in architecture. And, of course, jazz had been around since the turn of the century, but, this thing called modern jazz starts to happen immediately after World War II, and it's not a coincidence. But there's this kind of spirit about beginning again kind of renewal, and I think it pervades all the arts and pop culture. Like Leonard Bernstein. Now, he's not necessarily an avant-gardist or anything, but it's like the world was ready for something new. So this new superstar conductor comes in, just like Sinatra is the manifestation of this new superstar singer, and Oklahoma is the manifestation of a whole new wave of musical theater. And it's like in all the art forms, there's this kind of not necessarily a break with the past, but a sort of declaration of the future. And certainly that's all over jazz. And even though I don't know diddly about architecture, I would venture to say that was the spirit, the guiding spirit, the inspiration for that too.
It seemed like whenever you go on a tour, even just visit people's individual houses, they would be very proud of their music collection. And they would always want to talk jazz.
Right. No, that's true. It's definitely, it was the expression, jazz was in this kind of really special place in the 40s, 50s, up until, the big rock thing in the mid-60s, not even the original rock thing of the mid-50s, but jazz was in this very enviable place. It was plebeian, it was music for the people, but there also was an intellectual aspect of it. So it really had sort of had its cake and ate it. It was both things. It was for the more erudite, and it also was inclusive rather than exclusive at that point. So everybody was into it. And of course, then that sort of gets turned against it. By the end of the 60s, all of a sudden everybody is dismissing it as being too intellectual or something
too
like that.
Old, right?
Well, too old.
Something your parents did.
Yeah, exactly. But in that moment, though, it's like every house had a copy of Dave Brubeck Time Out, just like every house had a copy of the cast album to My Fair Lady. This was something that was everywhere,
Yeah, my mom had all those, for sure. Now, you host a show called Sing, Sing, Sing.
That's right. Thank you for mentioning.
And for people who don't know what those three words mean, where did that come from?
Well, Sing, Sing, Sing was
a big hit.
It was a song written by Louis Prima, and it comes out of Prima's first band, which he called Louis Prima and his New Orleans gang. People forget he was from New Orleans. They think of him as, this ultimate Vegas guy, which of course he was. But Sing, Sing, Sing was out of this tradition of lusty barroom sing-along songs, of which the most popular was The Music Goes Round and Round. And Louis's widow, Gia, told me, and I don't know if this is written down anywhere, that Louis and Bing Crosby were great pals. In fact, Prima makes a guest appearance in Bing's movie Rhythm on the Range in 1936, and they were both big racetrack fans. And one day they went to Santa Anita. It was before Del Mar, I guess, and they both won. They both came home with more money than they went there with, and they were so happy that they were singing along as they were driving in this car back to their houses, and Prima kept saying, "Sing, Bing, sing, sing, Bing, sing," and somehow that evolved into this idea for a song called Sing, Sing, Sing. Well, Prima records it with a vocal, and there's some early recordings of it, but the thing that nobody saw coming was that some of the swing bands began to play it. Fletcher Henderson played it. And then Benny Goodman started to play it, and the Benny Goodman arrangement, he made a record of it for RCA Victor. He was under contract to them. But after the record came out, they just kept playing it, and they kept changing it. They didn't just play the arrangement as it was. And a guy named Jimmy Mundy gets credit for the arrangement, but basically they kept adding things to it. And most famously, it got recorded at the Carnegie Hall concert, January 1938, and it was the climax of the concert for the Harry James solo. Actually, at the time, the Jess Stacy piano solo was the one that was most remarked upon in the jazz press, but now we remember for the Harry James trumpet solo and the Gene Krupa drum solo, and Benny, of course, Benny going after that amazing high F, I think it is at the end. And over the last, 80 years, Sing, Sing, Sing kind of became the most played theme almost of the entire swing era. And it's mostly that 1938 live version by Benny Goodman. And friends of mine who aren't jazz fans, whenever they want to talk about Benny Goodman, they always say, oh, of course, Sing, Sing, Sing was his biggest hit record. And I say, absolutely not. It was never even a hit record for him, because the version that was 10 minutes long, and it couldn't have been released in 1938 because of the technology. But not only that, nobody even thought of making a live record, and unless you were at the concert, nobody heard that version for another 15 years until the album came out in the LP era. And then it kind of became increasingly iconic, and now you hear it on commercials and everything, and it's a real valuable copyright for Louis Prima. But yeah, that kind of became the go-to song representing the entire swing era.
What I remember most about it was the drum solo.
Yeah, the drum solo is
Right.
what everybody remembers. Yeah, that amazing. So, I mean, I could talk about that song. I have more to say about it.
Clearly,
if
you
want me to.
could.
Yeah. The interesting thing about that is that idea of those sections where you just hear drums and clarinet and then you hear drums and trumpet was very far out there. And that was not generally what we think of as part of the swing era. But this idea, they used to call that freak style playing when you were sort of doing, it's almost like free jazz from a
Yeah.
generation later. And Artie Shaw had his response to it, which was a piece called Concerto for Clarinet, where they had these moments where you just heard the clarinet, being accompanied by drums or something like that. It was sort of like his answer to Sing, Sing, Sing. So it was kind of avant-garde, and because it was an extended piece, it was also sort of classical, and yet it was incredibly like funky and gut bucket at the same time. So Sing, Sing, Sing is kind of a remarkable piece in that regard,
You have really put out a lot of material about jazz. As a famous author dude, you've got
that's my handle. Right?
Yeah. You've got 9 books now?
I think it's 10.
10 books now? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's 10.
One question I wanted to ask you, famous author dude,
That's me.
is which of these bands that were so famous in the 40s and 50s are still around, have kind of continued with new people?
Oh, from that far back? Well,
Yeah.
even when I was a kid, you still had the Basie. I saw Basie once. There is a version of the Ellington Band. I haven't heard them in a while. There is an incarnation of the Cab Calloway Band. There is a Harry
Louis
James
Armstrong,
Band. There's tribute bands, but they're not directly connected to Armstrong. There's not like
Okay.
an official Armstrong band. Artie Shaw still had a band in the 80s and 90s. I saw him a few times.
Okay.
And I got to talk to him. Who was around? It's kind of a... Les Brown kept leading a band up until the day he died. And now I don't know if his son leads some kind of incarnation of that or not. But
Glenn Miller?
there is
Still-
a Glenn Miller band. I don't know how much they work, but yeah, they do work, and it's led by a guy named Nicky Hillshire, who's a really Nick Hillshire is this very, very wonderful 40s style crooner. He sounds sort of like Johnny Desmond more than Ray Eberle. Really, the Glenn Miller Band under Nick Hillshire, if you get a chance, I would commend you to see them because he's a very creative band leader, and they drag out some interesting stuff. They don't just play In the Mood. They play some of the more obscure arrangements from the
Yeah.
book. So it's a treat if you get to hear. And usually it's funny, in the old days, the Glenn Miller Band was sort of stigmatized as being like, the most unimaginative ghost band ever. But now they're very, I don't think that was necessarily true. But yeah, now if you get a chance to hear the Glenn Miller Band, I would recommend it. They played a concert at Town Hall in New York, like right before the pandemic. And somehow Leonard Maltin was in town, and I got him tickets, and we all went to hear it. So.
Oh, fun.
Yeah.
That's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
You are speaking at Modernism Week on a group called the Poll Winners, which
Yes.
I'd not heard of before. I think most people had not heard of before outside of jazz enthusiasts. So tell me about those.
Well, basically, it centers around Barney Kessel, who was probably, in the vast scheme of things, he was probably the biggest guitar star in the jazz world of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, kind of up until... this whole moment when jazz is still essentially a popular music. It's a popular music with like an intellectual aspect to it, but it is still, the music of the people. And Barney Kessel was the most recorded and probably lauded and probably idolized guitar player of that generation. He was born in Oklahoma, and he grew up playing guitar under the spell of Charlie Christian, who had been born in Texas, but he spent most of his formative years in Oklahoma. So he was considered Charlie Christian's successor. And of course, Charlie Christian is the kind of, not the first superstar guitarist, but one of the first. And certainly not just a superstar guitar player, but a musician who helps point the way from swing into modern jazz. And Kessel, who got to know Christian and got to play with him, and you could say that he studied with him, but it wasn't formal study. But they did get to play together. The Kessel was Charlie Christian's sort of number one successor. And he was probably the most famous guitar player as a leader in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And it's a period where there are not a lot. I mean, nowadays, ever since the 60s, when there's so many kids pick up guitars in emulation of, rock and roll people, guitar was not a prominent instrument up until that point. And he was sort of one of the first really prominent guitar players in jazz who would make 2 or 3 albums a year, would tour. And when all three of these musicians won the poll, and the other two being the great drummer Shelly Manne and the pioneering bassist Ray Brown, the three of them decided to get together, and they made an album called The Poll Winners, and it was so popular they made about 5 other albums. I do not know to what extent they toured as a unit, but they were all incredibly busy in the studios, and I don't know how much they worked live, but they made about 5 albums together, including a reunion album in the mid-'70s. And if you were a guitarist, if you were studying guitar in the 1950s, I mean, no matter if you were playing rock or folk or whatever, you would know who Barney Kessel was. He was just an omnipresent guitarist. He was probably the biggest superstar guitar player. And then, of course, in the 70s, particularly with the fusion movement, all of a sudden guitar assumes much more of a leading role in jazz. But in that period before, if you were a jazz fan in the mid-'50s and you had to name one guitar player, you probably would pick Barney Kessel.
Okay.
And the Poll Winners was like his most famous group and his most famous album. And he was a brilliant player who expanded on Charlie Christian's legacy and took it to whole other places. And sometimes you could say that Barney Kessel had the career that Charlie Christian might have had he not died at, I think, 24 of tuberculosis. So,
Did the Poll Winners as a group work with jazz vocalists or other groups during that time, or were they more independent?
I don't know how much they worked live at all. I wish at some point I got to delve into that. Barney Kessel worked with they all three of them individually worked with everybody. Of course, Ray Brown had been married to Ella Fitzgerald. Shelley Mann had played for Stan Kenton. He played for everybody. They were like omnipresent in the Los Angeles studios. In fact, one of the things in the presentation I'm showing is Barney Kessel's pages from his date book, and you could see that one day he'd be playing with a jazz group, the next day he'd be doing a soundtrack, and the next day he did a 3-day session with Elvis Presley. He was just, working with everybody all the time. We even have an interview clip where he shows all the different guitars that he uses for different purposes. He's got a banjo for when he's doing a Western. He's got different kinds of guitars. He's got a bass guitar for some other purpose. His most famous work with a vocalist was he plays behind Julie London on her most famous record. Not quite a hit. I mean, certainly it's a signature song, if not a hit. Cry Me a River, which is just voice and guitar. And it's got this eloquent, beautiful...
I know that recording.
No, everybody knows it. Of course you know it. My God. I wouldn't be talking to you if you didn't know that record.
Julie London's record covers, evidently back at the time, just drove men crazy, even though by today's standards, they were very tame.
Well... The thing about Julie London, I used to think, well, my opinion of her has really increased over the years, but she really was someone who had a career that was very much dependent on the invention of the LP because and modern technology, in the sense that, yes, she was very attractive on those covers and they're very sexy, and that definitely helped her, but also the fact that recording technology had improved so much that you could do a duo of voice and guitar and have it make sense, because you really couldn't do that in 78 RPM technology. And I think that's another one of the reasons that you could have guitar in general in the 50s and 60s, because when you had tape recording and then hi-fi, it made it much easier for the guitar to have a place. Whereas if you try to, there's so few guitar solos from the 1930s, for one reason is because it's really impossible to capture that with the technology that they had up until that time. So, it's one of the reasons that piano players became much more subtle. Like you have like a George Shearing or some of Nat Cole's things in the 50s that are, much more understated than somebody like Fats Waller or Art Tatum, who were these very, sort of full-fisted piano players, because you could do that as the technology got better, And Julie London, it would have been very hard for her to have existed in the 78 RPM era, but sort of the duo, A, you got to see her in these provocative outfits and poses and things, but B, you also got to hear her much better. So she was something to listen to as well as to look at. So,
And when I was growing up, she was famous as a nurse on Emergency with Bobby Troup.
It was sort of the late career salvation. A friend of, I can't remember the name of the author, but I've met him. But there's a very good biography called Go Slow that came out about 2 or 3 years ago of Julie London. And they say, that was sort of the salvation of their latter career. She was married to the excellent songwriter Bobby Troup, who was sort of the unofficial producer of her albums. And he, in addition to being an excellent songwriter, he had great taste in other people's songs. And one of the reasons I love to listen to Julie London albums is because Bobby Troup would help her pick out really great songs. I mean, that's one of the reasons that they're so much fun to listen to, is the song selection. And he was one of the guiding forces of her career. And they definitely were a great team.
One of the other groups that was very popular through that time was called the Wrecking Crew.
Well, the Wrecking Crew, Barney Kessel was a part of the Wrecking Crew at certain points, but it might be a stretch to say that they were popular because nobody heard of them except
Right.
in the business.
Within the business,
yeah,
they were immensely popular. Everybody wanted
right,
to record.
Exactly. If you were on the inside, they were the most in-demand rhythm section you could get, and definitely Barney Kessel, had been in and out of that. But yeah, now it's like a thing. But if you said the Wrecking Crew to somebody in 1960, they wouldn't necessarily know what you were talking about. Yeah.
And I
In
think
fact, Hal Blaine, I saw, has a star on the Palm Springs Walk of Fame. So
okay.
they should put one in for Barney Kessel, too. Are you listening? Yeah.
The Wrecking Crew was referenced a little bit by association in the Marvelous Ms. Maisel films because they featured a woman there who traveled with Ms. Maisel, who was based on the woman that traveled with the Wrecking
name?
Crew.
Yeah, the female bass player.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
that was a legitimate... Yeah, there's all these coded things in Mrs. Maisel. There's a singer who's supposed to be Johnny Mathis, and the guy, I forget the name of... The character's name is Shy Baldwin, but it's two different performers who play him. One is the actor on screen, and the other is the guy who supplies the singing voice, and that's Darius DeHaas, who's like a musical theater singer around New York. He's a wonderful performer, has a beautiful singing voice. I've seen him many times, and he's the nephew of the great singer-pianist Andy Bay, who was part of Andy and the Bay Sisters. So everything is kind of all tied into everything else.
I read that you're a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell, except when he talks about music.
Did I say that somewhere? Where did I say that? I love Malcolm Gladwell. Actually, I hate him because he's so much better looking and more successful than I am, and we're almost exactly the same age. But no, I love Malcolm Gladwell, although I don't always agree with the conclusions he comes to about music. But
what does he say about music?
He did this one program on how he thinks that this one song by Elvis Costello is the greatest song ever written, and he was just going on, and when he finally played the song, it was like anticlimactic. And I can't say I know that much about Elvis Costello, but there are other Elvis Costello songs that I like better. So, but I mean, he's Malcolm Gladwell. He's great. I wish I had I wish I could do a podcast for his company. He's terrific, but he's one of my favorite writers. I just don't always agree with him about music, But he probably doesn't always agree with me about the stuff that, he really does talk about. So, yeah.
So for jazz performers that are now in their 20s, 30s, 40s,
there's a ton.
Who do you really like and follow now?
Well,
it's new.
The obvious answer is Samara Joy. I was there. When I'm 100 years old, I hope I'll be telling people I was there when she won her first big break was she won the Sarah Vaughan vocal competition. I think it was 2019. And she just, within the last month, won the Grammy for Best New Artist. She's terrific, She's just so much fun. In fact, my buddy Tom and I went to see her at La Poisson Rouge less than a month ago. It was in January.
Is that a restaurant or a club?
No, it is... Well, Poisson Rouge is a music venue in the Lower West Side. It's on Bleecker Street. And it used to be the Village Gate. Now they call it the Poisson Rouge. And it's normally a rock venue or like alt rock or whatever, but it's I guess it's mainly for 20-year-olds who don't mind standing up because they don't have, seats. We didn't know that. So it was this 3-hour showcase. No, it was more like 4 hours, 3 acts in 4 hours. And we stood up for 3 hours just waiting to hear her. And at the end of it, we were like, yeah, that was totally worth it. So that's how great she is.
Oh, awesome.
But I've heard her many times. And yeah, when you ask there's a lot of great young singers. I can name musicians too, but I love Veronica Swift. I love Cecile McLaurin-Salvant. She's over 30 now. I love Cyril Aimee. I love Nicholas King. There are some great younger jazz-influenced singers out there. It seems like every few years there's a whole new crop of. I love Jasmine Horn. I love Voyo Satoshi, even though it's hard to pronounce his name. But it seems like every few years there's a new crop of singers, and I always feel like we're living in a perennial golden age.
Didn't he invent Bitcoin? Another Satoshi, perhaps.
The guy, that's the I'm sorry, that was the Japanese guy? His name is Satoshi or Satoshi?
Yeah.
Voyo Satoshi, it does sound Japanese. He's actually South African.
Okay.
And he kind of sings, he can do a really good Nat King Cole, but usually he sings more like himself. But he also does more African-influenced music, too. I've heard him do lots of different things. He and Veronica Swift and Jasmine Horn won the Thelonious Monk competition for singers, which would have been around 2000, I'm going to say 15. So I think it's the most recent. I don't know if there's been another competition for singers since then.
Well, Will, I'm going to look all those folks up now and invite them to come on the show.
Oh, great. Yeah.
So thank you so much for those names.
Sure.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's been fun. Thank you.
That was George talking jazz with Will Friedwald. Courtney Newman is a Palm Springs fixture, a local luminary, historian, and co-founder of PS Modcom, a nonprofit formed in 1999 and dedicated to the appreciation and preservation of desert modern architecture and design. He is also the owner of Modern Way, a mid-century mod furnishings showroom. Courtney is also a collector of stories about the classic entertainers of the 1950s through 1970s who spent their leisure time in Palm Springs. He shared some of those during Modernism Week and later with George Smart. Here's our conversation with Courtney Newman on showbiz in the desert.
Courtney, I understand that you're into some things that are really cool and retro, like the Three Stooges, the Marx Brothers, Jackie Gleason, Alan Sherman, Bob Hope, the Rat Pack. And I was wondering if you've ever heard one of my favorite podcasts, Gilbert Gottfried's Amazing Colossal Podcast.
I have not heard that one.
He passed away last year.
That's right.
And his show was totally Hollywood retro.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, hearing about that.
He was really into it and had all these guys on and did imitations on most of them, which was just fascinating.
Yeah, he had a great reverence for all that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
These your bodyguards?
Yes.
Okay. Courtney brought his own security team here,
That's right.
folks, today, and they're eyeing at me suspiciously from across the table. I don't know if they're armed or not, but they have headphones on, one of them. That's a sign of a security force right there. You run a store called Modern Way. What is that all about?
We're the oldest mid-century modern store in the desert. We're going into our 25th year. We specialize in mid-century modern vintage furniture from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and now even the 80s. So.
Well, it's funny to think of the 80s as retro, but it really is, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a long time ago now.
Yeah. Where is the store?
2500 North Palm Canyon, just up in it's called the Racket Club Center.
Mm-hmm. Just north of where we are here, right?
Yeah, just about a mile from where we are.
Okay. You have done a presentation at Modernism Week called Showbiz in the Desert, which is about how celebrities discovered Palm Springs and the surrounding area. Tell us about that.
Well, I've been coming out here since the 60s with my grandparents, and my grandfather kind of knew a few of those people, and so I kind of got to know them, and it's been a fascination of mine. And one of the things I wanted to talk about is, everybody talks about, when we have Modernism Week, about this house belonged to Frank Sinatra, or this house belonged to Bing Crosby, whatever. But a lot of people now, unfortunately, don't really know what those people did. It was just a famous name. So I kind of wanted to show them what those people did for a living, and what their act was, basically. So you could put an act to a name.
Yeah, if you ask a 13-year-old who the Beatles were, they don't know.
Right.
So you got to really do the background to get the context.
Well, that's like Dinah Shore. People out here, they either know it as a golf tournament or they know it as a road that's a shortcut to Cathedral City. So
tell our listeners, for example, who Dinah Shore was.
Well, she was a singer, basically, an entertainer throughout the 50s, 60s, on up until she passed away. Yeah.
And she had her own talk show?
She did. She had her own talk show. I think she had a variety show even for a little while, too. Yeah.
And she built a wonderful house over in Las Palmas?
She did, which has been all restored, and it's a beautiful house. Yeah.
Leonardo DiCaprio owns it now?
Right, and it's Donald Wexler was the architect.
And that's a gorgeous property to visit. They have events there occasionally.
Yeah, it's amazing.
That you can go
amazing
through.
Property. It's kind of in a little celebrity row there, too. Lena Horne had a house there. A few other people had a house in that area. Yeah.
I think Adam West had a house nearby there.
He had a house. Well, he had a couple houses out here. He had a house in, the border between Cathedral City and here, which was an amazing house. And I think he had a house up in Vista, Las Palmas.
Okay. Yeah, that was the one I was referring to.
Yeah.
So tell people now who Lena Horne and Adam West were.
Jeez. Well, Adam West was Batman, basically. There's a great
in the 60s.
Yeah, in the 60s on the original TV show. And Lena Horne was just an amazing singer.
Her big hit was Stormy Weather, I think, right?
Yeah.
Adam West as Batman and Burt Ward as Robin.
That's right.
Did this really campy Batman series, very funny, that ran for 3 years. in the 60s.
That's right.
And did a couple of reunion specials, I think, too.
They did, and they did a movie, and, the claim to fame was they always had celebrities. There were big movie stars and celebrities as the villains, and also that thing when they were climbing up the side of a building, Sammy Davis Jr. would pop his head out, or Jerry Lewis would pop his head out. So that was it. And I used to run into him all the time at the grocery store, Adam West, and, still people come up to him. Even young people knew who Adam West was, so it's nice to see.
Well, he had a real huge second career in the voiceover business.
He did. Yeah, and then all the Comic-Con things and everything he did. There's a great documentary that I think his son made about him that's really worth watching. It just goes through his whole life and everything. He was really kind of a cool guy.
How did the celebrity culture affect Palm Springs?
It put Palm Springs on the map, basically. I mean, this was a sleepy little desert town. It was a train outpost at one time, like in the 20s and 30s. And, there was the thing I say in my showbiz presentation. They had a thing called the 100-mile rule in Hollywood. If you were working in Hollywood, your contract said basically that you could not travel farther than 100 miles to take a little break or whatever. And Palm Springs happened to be 90 miles away, so it was the perfect retreat. And then the 30s, it was people like Cary Grant built a house here. Lucille Ball was even out here when she was just a starlet, having pictures taken at the El Mirador Hotel. Al Jolson was out here. They all had big Spanish mansions out here. And then in the 40s, the people like Bob Hope and Bing Crosby all started coming out here. So it just built and built and built.
And what about today? Because there was a long period, like in the 70s and 80s, where celebrities weren't coming at all, and Palm Springs was, on a decline. And then in the 90s, people rediscovered modernism again and started buying these houses and restoring them, and some of the celebrities are coming back, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of celebrities now. The difference is, when I was a kid growing up, and even before that, I would be in line at this little breakfast place called Luis's with my grandparents, and I'd be standing in line with Bob Hope. Now, the celebrities, they're not out in the public like they were, so they'll have their houses, and they'll either be behind gates or they'll be walled off. A lot of people like Leonardo DiCaprio, and there's a lot of rock and roll musicians moving out here too.
Okay.
But it's more of a private thing.
Yeah.
When the celebrities were out here in the golden age, it was a playground for them.
And one of the things I understand is that when people built out here, they were much more willing to be modern than they were back where they lived at home.
Yeah, I mean, that's the reason that the whole modern movement really took off. It wasn't called mid-century modern then, it was just a modern home.
Yeah.
But they had their traditional house in L.A. or in New York or wherever they had it, and they were willing to take a chance out here and build something more exciting, more interesting, and also the weather kind of related to that too, because it was indoor-outdoor living here, which you couldn't have in like the Midwest or anywhere like that. So that was a big part of it.
In the late 90s, you helped start an organization out here. What was that?
Yes. When we first opened our store in 99, we started something called the Palm Springs Modern Committee. And the first meetings were held in the back of my store. There were like 6 or 8 people, and then it grew and it grew and it grew. And now Palm Springs Modern Committee is huge, and we do about 18 events during Modernism Week, and we do events all year round. We have a scholarship program. We give away $10,000 a year to young kids that are interested in studying architecture or design. So it's really become a big thing.
And do you also publish books?
We fund books to be published.
Okay.
People come to us because we have money that we need to use because we're a nonprofit, so we'll give grants to people doing books. We're helping the Architectural Alliance right now with a book on the school. It's called the School of Palm Springs Architecture. There's like the Sarasota School, things like that. And so there's always been an argument that there's a Palm Springs School of Architecture, specific style.
And there's a Palm Springs Preservation Foundation, right?
Right. They were here before us, but they kind of didn't pay a lot of attention to modern architecture. They did a lot of the Spanish and colonial kind of architecture that was out here.
Okay.
And then when modernism really took off kind of in 1998, there were a couple articles written, 99, in Esquire and Vanity Fair. And that's when the whole thing just kind of blew up when we came out here and formed Palm Springs Modern Committee.
And how did Palm Springs Preservation Foundation and PS ModCom evolve into Modernism Week?
Well, there was a company that decided back in about 2000 to do one of their traveling shows, conventions, where they, like an antique show or something like that, but they decided to specialize in modernism. And they would have it, they used to have it in LA, and they have it in other big cities, and they decided with everything going on here that they would do it in Palm Springs. And so our organization and PSPF and also the Palm Springs Museum and the Architectural and Design Council all decided, wouldn't that be a great weekend to just do some other events around that and put it all together? And so initially, for the first few years, it was a weekend. And then it grew to a week, and now it's 10 days, and there's like 9,000 events. So it just grew and grew and grew.
And so Modernism Week is kind of an umbrella organization that organizes everything.
Yes, they have a board of directors, separate board of directors and everything, and they put everything together with all of the other organizations.
They have the central ticketing system and sell everything and do the scheduling for your 18 events and a couple of hundred other events.
And they have their own events that they put on as well. And there are a lot of neighborhood organizations, a lot of international organizations that put on events.
Since you've been here so long, what are you seeing in terms of new modern going up, and what do you think of it? Is it good? Is it not so good?
I have to be careful. There's a lot of good architecture being built. Unfortunately, what happened maybe about 6-8 years ago was a lot of people just came in and decided to take advantage of the boom just for profit. And so a lot of things were being built that were very derivative. They say, oh, there's a zigzag roof, just stick a zigzag roof on this building, or there's a stone wall, just slap a stone wall. So that kind of muddied the waters and made some ugly things out here. But then there are a lot of really good young architects building things out here, and also in the high desert where you can experiment a little more. There's been some great stuff being built.
The high desert being Joshua Tree area?
Tree, Yucca Valley, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's still places in Palm Springs where you can buy a second home for $500,000, $600,000.
Yeah, when I came out here, you could buy one for $90,000.
Really?
In 1999, yeah. But now, you can get a second home for. It just sounds so crazy to me.
Yeah.
But it sounds like a deal to $500,000-$600,000. Mostly condos and that. If you really want a house, it's going to be start at $800,000.
$800,000 here.
Start. Yeah.
Have you seen any decline in interest in mid-century, or is it still growing?
It's still growing. It's more now of just a universal thing. It's more a fun thing to do. There's still people that are really intensely interested in it, but now it's become a general public, which is great because it just brings a lot of people out here.
In the progression of modern interest, you're kind of the gateway drug, right? I mean, when someone comes to your store and buys a chair, that's when they start to want a condo or a house, or it kind of takes them up the chain.
It can work both ways. People come in when they bought a place and they want to add some furniture for it, or they come in and they see something really cool and say, I need a house to go with it. So, it's both. Yeah.
I've seen so many Cape Cod homes and barn homes and farmhouses that have those one or two pieces of modernist furniture in them that people just, if the house burned down, they'd grab those first.
Yeah, that's true.
Courtney, thank you so much for speaking with me. I appreciate your coming by.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, great.
That was our conversation with Courtney Newman. Susan Claassen is best known for starring in the critically acclaimed A Conversation with Edith Head, in which Claassen plays the legendary Hollywood costume designer. Edith Head was the go-to designer for actresses such as Mae West, Dorothy Lamour, Barbara Stanwyck, Ginger Rogers, Ingrid Bergman, Elizabeth Taylor, Audrey Hepburn, Grace Kelly, Shirley MacLaine, and virtually every major actress of that era. She dressed men too, including John Wayne, Rock Hudson, Steve Martin, and even Elvis in Blue Hawaii. And she won 8 Academy Awards for costume design, still a record. Susan Claassen, who looks just like Edith Head, dishes behind-the-scenes stories with Tom, poolside adjacent during a rainy Palm Springs day.
So I was sitting in this room, and I swear I watched a woman walk by the window outside a few minutes ago who looked like she was Edith Head, the famous costume designer from the Hollywood golden era. And it turns out it was Susan Claassen. And Susan's with us right now, along with Stuart Moulton. And the two of you are part of a Is it a play?
It's a production called A Conversation with Edith Head. And it's very interactive, so the audience plays a big part because every show is different, and we set the play wherever we are. So Miss Head will be right here in Palm Springs, where she did many a film preview with Bob Hope. So it really is
she's right at home here.
She's right at home.
Yeah.
She's right at home.
So are you interactive? Are you taking questions?
Yes, we do. It's set in the time period when she was working at Universal Studios on the film Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid. And Steve Martin is in it, directed by Carl Reiner. That was her last film that she did. And the film is actually...
So this is her at the end of her career.
It's at the end, reflecting some.
Now, she doesn't know it's the end, does she?
But she doesn't know it's the end, but there's things have gone on that have led her toward the end and the legacy. And it's a legacy that will go unbroken. You know, she worked on 1,131 films in a 60-year career.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's like a lot of movies a year.
That's 30 or 40 in the heyday when she was at Paramount. And she was the first woman who was the head of a costume department. It was unheard of. It was definitely a boys' club when she came in.
Really?
But she was so smart that she really was a sponge and learned from some of the great designers, Travis Banton, and then took over the costume department.
She was also smart enough to know how to play the game. And
she played it better than anybody. Yeah. And as a woman, she had to play it better than anyone.
So when was her earliest mark on Hollywood?
1923.
Wow, that's early.
Oh, that's early. Yeah. Okay. 1923 is when she began. And her background wasn't in design. She has a master's from Stanford in languages.
Really? But she must have had an interest in
Well, she was teaching at the Hollywood School for Girls, and suddenly her duties were expanded to include the teaching of an art class. We like to say that there's an assumption if you spoke French, you could paint. Well, she knew nothing about it, so she took some art classes. And then she needed money during her summer holiday. She was looking through the classifieds. She saw an ad, wanted sketch artist, work for Cecil B. DeMille, write Howard Greer for appointment. Now, Howard Greer was the head of the Paramount Costume. She knew that. His name was synonymous with Hollywood glamour. So she borrowed, this is Hollywood lore, she borrowed sketches from her classmates because all she could draw were oceans. And she borrowed these sketches. So she had landscape, she had interior design, she had magazine. And Howard Greer said he had never seen so much talent in any one portfolio.
She was just kind of bluffing it?
Well, she was kind of bluffing it, but knew that she would study and understand and learn the business from the inside out. And Howard Greer found it rather amusing, and she really had OJT, on-the-job training.
How old was she at that point?
Well, she was in her 20s, late 20s.
Yeah, okay.
And then proceeded up, and she was a founder of the Costume Designers Guild, Fashion Group International, and she was very involved in the community and very involved in understanding the importance of how to work with directors, because each director has their own special language.
Was there a costume designer at the time, that a man, I'm assuming, that was more prominent that she kind of knocked off a pedestal? Or
probably all of them.
Oh, okay.
Travis Banton, Adrian, Walter Blanca, you can name them. Nobody. When you think of costume design and you put a face on what a Hollywood costume designer, it's Edith Head. There was currently there's a stamp, a postage stamp. She was a Google Doodle. There's an animated character, Edna Mode. And
did she ever appear in a movie?
Yes. Yes, she did. She appeared in a movie, and she was in the Oscar. She was in Lucy Gallant. She also was on Columbo, playing herself.
Okay. So, right. I mean, that's why in popular culture, her look with the bangs and the glasses that's iconic and recognizable.
It's iconic.
And helps you probably.
Well, and I've always looked this way. This is me that you are seeing. When I get into the full Edith mode, it's even more striking a resemblance. But she has 8 Academy Awards. And for the first 21 years of the Academy Awards, there was no category for costume design. Only imagine how many she would have won. That's why I say it's a record that'll go unbroken.
Did she win the first?
No.
Oh.
You had to bring up the painful moment. Thank you, Tom.
No problem.
Thank you, Tom. It was
the public has a right to know.
Real. Okay, full disclosure, no, but it was painful for her. But she survived.
What would you say is her most impressive accomplishment in costume design? Wow. Is there one?
Survival.
Right.
I would think ones that she loved. Rear Window. Fabulous. Any of the Hitchcock. She designed for all the Hitchcock blondes. She and Hitch were great friends.
Wow.
So she did Vertigo. She did, as I said, Rear Window. She did To Catch a Thief, which are magnificent. So all of them.
And to do not just one particular style, because any costume designer has to know different periods of time, of course, but to do the vast periods of time, because, she lived through a lot of them, of course, 60-year career. But, I mean, even within To Catch a Thief, to have the contemporary of the day clothing, and then those period pieces for the masked ball, for the ball. I mean, just exquisite.
And it was different then also because what she understood, and I think there are many costume designers now who understand this, that the costume should never upstage the narrative of the film. And she understood that. She understood that costuming should further the narrative. It should tell the story. So one of her greatest challenges was making Grace Kelly look plain in The Country Girl.
Oh,
and
that's a tough ticket.
Yeah, really.
From glamorous in Rear Window to plain, but her red carpet gown was stunning. And Edith designed that. In the day when there were studio designers, if you were going to an appearance or red carpet or an award ceremony, you would go to your studio designer and they would create it. There were no stylists. It was the Hollywood costume designers that did that, or makeup. And that was a year that gorgeous dress that is always, to this day, on the top 10 of
best
all-time
looks,
red carpet looks, that Grace Kelly dress designed by Edith Head.
Wow. So you do this all over the country?
The world.
Yeah.
Our first international was in Tbilisi in the Republic of Georgia.
Wow.
At an international theater festival. We've had the privilege of being in Edinburgh. We've had the privilege of London, several times in Canada, and then coast to coast.
But the folks in Tbilisi, do they know
they
who
knew
Edith?
her. Well, and I chose to do it in English. I could have had it simulcast in Georgian, but most people, or the majority, speak Georgian, then Russian, then English. But the minute that you see an Elizabeth Taylor gown or you see a Grace Kelly, that's the common language.
Well, so Hollywood is so loved.
Yeah.
That's throughout the world too.
So
we know that.
And it's that Hollywood that's meant. It's the
golden age.
And then it's interesting too, because I stay as Edith after the show, because people want to share a memory. They want to share going to a great movie palace or having met Edith, or I know I'm not Edith Head, but for a moment people can.
Do you?
Yes, I do. They can escape it, and have a respite from today.
And one of my biggest joys of doing this play is, as the host,
and that is your character's name.
Yeah,
host.
Stuart Moulton, but it's called the host. And I get to meet all the audience as they come in because I'm gathering questions from them.
Right.
And it's such a thrill because there's always a question I haven't had before. We get a lot of lot of the same questions,
Sure.
your favorite this or your least favorite that or that kind of thing. But lots of people will ask about a favorite star that they've dressed.
Oh, right.
And so for me, it's a different show every night, which is fun. I get to take those questions.
It helps to like people.
And tell about
we were doing in North Hollywood at the Oak Hotel, which was great. It's a small theater, kind of horseshoe shaped. The show played beautifully in it. And in the large theater right next to it, Debbie Reynolds was doing her show. And of course, Edith dressed Debbie. And they were great friends. But I was going through the audience getting questions, and I asked this particular gentleman and his wife, I said, this is a conversation with Edith Head. Is there anything you'd like to ask Miss Head this evening? And I was poised with my pen and paper, and he looked at me and kind of a little bit of a chip on his shoulder and kind of raised eyebrow, and he said, well, I was her lawyer. And I said...
It is a small town, isn't it?
Well, and this is the thing. Whether we're playing Hollywood or whether we're playing Des Moines, it's like 99% of the time there is someone in that audience who either knew her or walked in one of her fashion shows that she did across the country. So that's fascinating. But anyway, I said, oh, well, as her attorney, then you probably have all the scoop already, right? So I rushed back to the dressing room and I popped in and I said to Susan, I was like, your lawyer's here. And Susan's half into Edith's drag at this point. She looks at me. I said, Edith's attorney is here. And she said, oh, okay. Where's he sitting? So when Edith makes her entrance into the show, she chats a bit with the audience always. And, and she stops and she says, I think his name was David. I can't remember. But she says, David, good to see you. Oh, it's ladies and gentlemen, if you need an attorney in Hollywood, this is the man. And you'll have my tickets for the Academy Award this time. She goes, I'll be on it. She always gave her lawyer her tickets because she was working the red carpet.
She was and commentating.
Yeah.
So was he telling you all of this before?
No.
So who's gonna know this except Edith and her attorney and Susan Claassen?
So you have really done your homework.
Oh,
always. Because
beyond.
it's an awesome responsibility if you're keeping a legacy alive.
Yeah.
It's an awesome, and I take it to my heart.
So how long have you been doing this?
I began it premiered in February of 2002.
Okay.
So 21 years.
What did you do before this?
Well, I still do. I'm an actor. I'm a director. I'm managing artistic director of the Invisible Theater in Tucson.
Right. I mean, you are acting the whole time you're up there.
Yes,
being her.
But I'm also administrator. I raise, for our theater company that celebrated its 51st anniversary season, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Where
is
in
this?
Tucson, Arizona.
Tucson. Okay.
So yes, and with this, it was so. Because after
they all come up and want to chat and Edith does photos, so you can get your photo with Edith, which of course everyone loves, and the attorney, who was much less of a chip on his shoulder at that point.
Did he take it well?
His face, because I like
when she said about the Academy Awards,
and he it was like a deer in
eyes
headlights.
like saucers.
Yeah.
Oh wow!
He was like, how could she know that? And he said to me after the show, he pulled me aside and he said, everybody should get to spend a couple hours with a departed friend.
Oh.
And it was like, and I went, this, ladies and gentlemen, this is why we do this show and do our craft.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at.
Yeah.
It's just, it's
all,
a treat.
I mean, these are the things we hold when we were in London or in Edinburgh. And people would say, Miss Head, of course, Miss Head, during the war. Seeing your name and seeing the films on the big screen and gowns by Edith Head, it gave us a respite from the war and what we were going through.
Oh, wow.
And cinema does that.
Yeah.
It just gives that escape.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, did they need it back then.
Yeah.
Yeah, and boy, do we need it now. People, and we are thrilled that, our performance here sold out a few weeks ago.
Yeah. Is this your first time in Palm Springs? Or have you
we're here. We did 3 performances, I think in 2015.
Yeah.
We did 3 performances here, and it was wonderful. And but our first time at the Annenberg, which will be a great...
Okay. So where do you go with this? I mean, this is your life work. I guess,
It is a joy. And not many people can say that after doing a play for 21 years, but it's a joy every single time to do it, and it changes depending on who's in the audience. At our opening in North Hollywood, Norman Lear was there, who I knew, but he was there, and we could talk about a film that he or Barbara Rush, or when Tippy was there, we would reminisce about stories.
Oh, that must be so much fun.
It's so much fun, and it just brings like a breath to some people who that certainly was their heyday.
Yeah.
And if they can come back, this was, we did it at North Coast Rep, which is in Solana Beach, California. And we got notice at the box office that a woman who had been a model for Edith was coming. And at that point, Patty, who's my collaborator who wrote the book, Edith Head's Hollywood, was doing the interview and gathering questions, and we got enough information. So she came. She was in a wheelchair, but she stood up straight as could be in the wheelchair, sat as straight as could be.
Right.
And you could tell she was a model. Her children and grandchildren brought her. They said when they saw the ad in the paper, she began getting dressed, and this was weeks before. And
Not
when
yet, Mom.
Really. And then, because that particular version had an intermission, and when I came back and I spotted her, I go, Gladys, you are looking so well. Now, we always fought about what color looked best on you. You said purple, I said red. She said, yes, Miss Head. Yes, Miss Head. And I said, who won? You did, Miss Head. You did, Miss Head.
Oh, my goodness.
And then after we did photos, and her children said, if this would be her last day on this earth, it would have been her happiest day.
So to have that kind of endorsement is,
I mean, it's just,
you really can't get any better than that.
You can't get better than that.
Wow.
And to have a vehicle like this where your acting partner is the audience,
right? They're sort of amateur volunteers,
and it's
but they're
so
real people.
fun. But like Susan said, I mentioned earlier, it's a different show for us every night. Based on what they
improv.
ask. Yeah,
There's definitely an arc to the piece, and the set is comprised of photographs. We can use real Edith photographs and all of her stars. And we've recreated 2 of the gowns from A Place in the Sun, Elizabeth Taylor gown, the Betty Davis dress from All About Eve, and some of the miniatures. So when you walk into the theater, you're just transported back. And it just, you see all these great stars because she literally dressed everyone. Everyone, plus, females and males. Cary Grant, Robert Redford, Paul Newman. We go through the list.
Montgomery Clift,
and Elizabeth Taylor. I often will do an educational matinee for students because they know Edna Mode from The Incredibles.
Right,
so I put it into their vernacular.
She really has crept into popular culture.
Totally.
Yeah, more so than name another costume director.
You can't. Yeah. And also, if she were alive today, she would be the biggest podcast blogger because she was syndicated in 35 magazines, she in newspapers. She was on Art Linkletter. She did TV. She did radio. She went out into every community. She did fashion shows.
Did she ever? She did not marry, did she?
Twice.
Oh, she married twice.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Are there children?
No children.
Okay. I was going to ask you how the family.
Yeah, well, her estate was left to the Motion Picture and Television Fund, and they're totally supportive. The Academy loves it. They've loaned us 2 prop Oscars that we can have on the set because you can't do a play about Edith Head and not talk about Oscars.
Right. She did finally get some.
Yes. Oh, yeah. More than anyone else. More than any other woman, Edith Head. More than Katharine Hepburn.
Really?
Oh, yeah. She has more Academy Awards.
And going back to what you were alluding to earlier, how universally she's known in the syndication and all of that, what's really fun, again, for me, because I'm in the audience with everybody. and listening to the questions and Edith's interaction with them. And very often, gentlemen will come with their wives because their wives really want to come see, Edith Head. And the men are the ones who are blown away because she was such a business force. We talked about a male-driven Hollywood earlier.
Right.
And the fact that, she could play the game. She could sidle up against the heads of the studios and chat with them and ran a business.
Did she have a fashion line?
No, she never did. She had patterns.
Try to talk her into that? Or?
Well, she would design personal wardrobe for her stars, but she never did a fashion line. Macy's did a line of pajamas from a film.
Okay.
That was homage-y, but she never did that. But for Vogue, she did patterns. And she liked to share what she knew. And she wrote 3, the 2 books, How to Dress for Success, The Dress Doctor is what she considered herself to be. And then my collaborator, Patty Calistro, with Edith posthumously wrote Edith Head's Hollywood. So it's sort of in 2 voices. She had to get everything substantiated. And Edith tended to, shall we say, just stretch the truth sometimes a little bit.
Started at an early age.
Yes, she did.
And it's worked out for her.
It worked out beautifully for her. So it's a great book. It's called Edith Head's Hollywood, and it's in 2 voices. The world according to the facts and the world according to Edith.
That's great.
So
occasionally in the show, I will correct Miss Head on a misfact that she has spoken.
Accidentally misspoken. Yeah, but we don't want to give away anything. But when people see
But it's great fun when she takes
really
me to
is true
task.
to life.
Yeah.
So if somebody wants to see you in this show or to see Edith, how can they find out where you're going to be when you're going to be in their town?
Website, Edith Head, 1 word, 2 H's in there, edithhead.biz.
Okay.
B-I-Z.
B-I-Z.
Yes, and they can, always contact us because whenever we're able to, we love doing the show.
Well, Susan and Stuart, thank you so much for bringing Edith Head to U.S. Modernist Radio.
We're thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
That was my conversation with Susan Claassen. I should add that after we finished recording, she leaned over to me and said, "And young man, next time we meet, I expect you to be dressed in a suit." I don't think she meant a swimsuit. So that's it. A wrap on this year's amazing Modernism Week in Palm Springs. As everyone who was there remembers, this year featured some very unseasonably cold and wet weather. But we made the best of it. There are still literally thousands of people having a wonderful time exploring the architecture they love and experiencing the uniqueness of Palm Springs through food, art, design, and lots of drinks by the heated pool at the Skylark. As we say, Modernism Week is a must-do on your modernist bucket list.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Want to go with us to Modernism Week in February 2024? Just email me at george@usmodernist.org.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to our past shows, discover documentation of 20,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.1 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Kelly Policelli researched over 40 guests for our Modernism Week interviews. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild.
Tom and I will be back next week to this locality to share a heaping helping of our hospitality. Architecture, that is.
Yep.
Swimming pools, movie stars. Y'all come back now, you hear?
I can't carry a tune.
I can't either, but that's the whole point of it.
Doesn't stop you from trying.